In this lecture, we're going to talk about administrative personnel security controls. We have talked about the three types of controls: administrative, technical, and physical. Now, let's look more at the administrative ones, or directive controls. And this is where we have our policies, our procedures, the regulations we need to adhere to in our industry, and we use training to raise our employees' awareness. So for our administrative security, we can use least privilege. That is where we give the employee exactly the access rights they need, no more, no less. And if at some point in the future the employee needs different access or more access, well, then we go through the entire process again and we give them the new exactly what they need, no more, no less. You can also think of least privilege as we give them the least amount of privilege to do their job. And least privilege is mostly used in organizations where they use mandatory access control. It is inherently more secure than need to know, but it also takes a lot of time and a lot of effort to maintain. In case we have an emergency, then we may not have the time or the resources to give people more access, and that might make the emergency worse. So, in most places, we use need to know. Here, we grant the user way more access than they need for their day-to-day job, but they're not allowed to access that data unless they have a clear need to know. To illustrate this, I normally use the example of a hospital. We give all the nurses, all the doctors access to all patient records. We don't wait until they're treating a certain patient to give them access. If we did that, lives might be lost. So everybody has access to everything, with the very clear understanding you can only access the files when you are treating a patient. Now, if you remember Octomom, she had her kids at Kaiser, and someone, we don't know who, leaked her information to the press. After the fact, Kaiser went in and did an audit and found 15 employees who had looked at the medical files and they did not have a need to know. Since the leak got published pretty widely, I'm assuming they got treated harsher than they normally would have. Regardless, most of those 15 people got fired. And we have no clue if they actually were the people who leaked the information. It could have been someone treating her. That's beside the point. They did not have a need to know. They broke their contract. Next up, we have separation of duties. And we use separation of duties as an internal control to prevent fraud and errors. Let's say our organization needs to buy something. We don't have the same person enter the purchase order, approve it, and issue the check. If Bob could do all that himself, fraud is much more likely. Now, having separation of duties doesn't mean that fraud won't happen. It just means it's less likely. They can be in collusion. Maybe Bob and two of his coworkers are in on it all together. It's still going to happen. It's just less likely. And if you're in a smaller organization, maybe one person does two out of these. That's okay. Remember, for the exam, we assume you're in a large organization and we have the money, the time, the personnel to do everything right. Answer from that point of view. Job rotation is another administrative control we can use, and we do this as well for detecting errors and fraud. Let's say Bob is the only person in the company that signs checks for vendors, and he has been doing this for 20 years. Us rotating someone else into that job for a couple of weeks might give us the ability to spot any wrongdoings. This can also have the added benefit that it helps with employee burnout. Bob might be sick and tired of signing checks every day, all the time. Doing something else for part of the time might be amazing for Bob. The job rotation can also help our employees get a fuller vision of the entire business and understand how everything works together. When I worked as the IT manager for the credit union, we had job rotation, and we were, as IT is in most places, understaffed. And even with that, we still had our employees go out for 1 week every year and work in another part of the organization. Because we're only IT, we only talk to IT people. We only understand the IT piece of the pie. So with my team going out and visiting other parts of the organization, we found a ton of places where we could make improvements. And with those inexpensive improvements, those departments saved a lot of time and a lot of money. So in our organization at least, other than the beneficial education effect it has, it also produced a positive ROI. Mandatory vacations are done much for the same reasons. If Bob is still the guy signing the checks, every so often we need someone else to do it. We need Bob to not be there and not have access, again, to prevent fraud. For mandatory vacations, it is critical that we never warn Bob that this is coming. Because if Bob knows, he's going to tell his accomplices, hey, don't send me any fake invoices for the next 3 weeks because I am going to be on vacation. Send them to me in 4 weeks. So we go in, we say, hey, Bob, you're now on vacation. Enjoy. Then we lock all Bob's accounts so he can't go in and change anything. And then we do an audit of all his accounts, just in case there is any fraud we can detect. Now, doing the audit doesn't mean we're going to detect the fraud. Even if it's there, it just gives us a higher chance. And none of these countermeasures by themselves is going to be enough. But it is just like with everything else we do in IT security, we have multiple overlapping complementary security measures, our defense in depth. In most organizations, when we have a new employee joining us, we have them sign an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement. We have touched on these before when we hire consultants, contract workers, or we have someone develop software for us. They sign an NDA. It is no different for our internal employees. And NDAs can, like any other agreement, be really restrictive or really loose. That's really based on what we do and how secure we need to be. The NDA in itself doesn't really do anything, it's just a piece of paper. But it might make our employees think twice before they leak confidential information, and if they do, then it allows us to prosecute them because they broke the NDA. If your organization doesn't have NDAs, while it might be common sense you don't leak information, employees technically never promised not to. So, use NDAs. It is very, very common in the US to do background checks on any employee. We check their personal references. Do they actually have the degrees they claim to? Do they have the certifications? Is their employment history correct? Do they have criminal records? And we can sometimes even check credit history. It is less common and more invasive, but there are definitely jobs where it makes sense. Let's say we're hiring someone to work with a lot of money. Well, if they have financial issues, they have a low credit rating, they owe a lot of money, maybe they're not the right person. And for most jobs, the background check is something we do once, then we hire them, and then we don't care again. But for jobs where you handle sensitive data, it can be an ongoing process. Every so often, we do a new background check to see if any new flags were raised. If not, well then we will check again next year or in 3 years or 5 years. As I mentioned, in the US, background checks are almost for everything. I mean, you can get a job at McDonald's and there may still be a background check. In the 35 years or so I lived and worked in Denmark and Europe, I've had one background check. And I think that one made sense. I was being hired as a network administrator to work on the core IP backbone for the entire infrastructure of Denmark and a good part of 3 or 4 other countries. So you want to make sure when you hire someone for a position like this, you don't have someone who has a bad day and breaks the internet for 5 million people. And with every single job I have had in the US, there has been a background check. Every single job. So in our organization, right, we have this new employee. They pass the background check, they sign the NDA, we hire them, then we start monitoring their privileges. And there are many places in the private sector, even more in the public sector, where this just doesn't happen. But remember, you are in the perfect world of the exam. Everything is done right. With employees who have more privileged access, just like we might have the recurring background checks, we also monitor their privileges more. Because if they do something they shouldn't, they can compromise much more and they can break much more of our data and our infrastructure. This should be as much as possible automated. We don't want someone to sit there and keep an eye on it. Just like anything else, we have certain events that trigger alerts, then someone's going to look at it. We have a baseline of what they should access to do their work, when they should access it, and anything outside of that may raise a red flag. If enough red flags are raised, well then we might do an audit. And this was what I just talked about. We monitor accounts and especially privileged accounts. And for that, we use a PAM system, and that is either Privileged Account Management or Privileged Access Management. They are used interchangeably, but there are differences. Some years ago, it used to be more account, now it's more access. Privileged Account Management is making sure that the account is safeguarded. Privileged Access Management is keeping the account safe, also keeping an eye on what the account can access and do. The more an account has access to, the more we monitor the what, when, how, where, why of whatever that account is accessing. And to ensure our PAM system is working right, then we have full monitoring. That means everything. We limit privileges not to a point of least privilege, but if they don't have a need for it, we remove it. Then we use multi-factor authentication, and this is a big one. Multi-factor authentication is one of the cheapest and simplest things we can implement to make our account and access management much more secure. We monitor all remote connections. We make sure that all our logs and records are immutable, and that really just means they are unable to be changed. So even someone with admin privileges to everything can't go in and alter the logs. Then we have continual monitoring of everything. We have anomaly detection. We have talked about that before too. If I always log in from this IP in this time frame using Google Chrome, and all of a sudden I log in from a different IP or a different browser or outside the normal time windows I would use, it is abnormal. Then we have full visibility of all admins. That means that all admins are accounted for. There are no invisible admin accounts, and there are no group accounts. For all of our users on our systems, we monitor our sensitive data, critical systems, insider and outsider threats, and make sure that we meet the compliance and regulatory requirements that we have. A regular user may not have access to much of this. For them, we monitor their performance and see where we can improve the efficiency. Now, with our privileged users, that is where we have that access matrix. What was done, when was it done, how was it done, why was it done, where was it done, and so on. Then we keep an eye on all our servers. That includes the jump servers, all endpoints, and all remote workstations. Let's finish this lecture by looking at logging and monitoring, threat intelligence, and UEBA. While logging and monitoring are very closely related, they're not the same thing. Many people use them interchangeably. Since this is for an exam, you need to be very clear on what both are. So logging, that is just managing the logs from all of our systems, applications, our entire infrastructure. It is just the raw data. We don't do anything. Monitoring is us making sure that all of our applications and our infrastructure is available. It responds to user requests within a reasonable time frame. It alerts us of issues. That is the raw data being used. You can't really have monitoring without logging because there's no data, and the logging by itself does nothing because it is just the raw data. We need both. Next up, we have threat intelligence, and that can be a threat feed. It is just a stream of raw, current potential threats. We can then look at that raw data to get actual usable data. That can be suspicious domains, certain malware hashes, potential malicious code, flagged IPs. And then once we have extrapolated that from the raw data, well, then we can use that to compare to our ingress and egress traffic. Then we have threat hunting. That is an active verb. That is us actively looking for threats on our network. Here, we assume the attackers are already on our systems in our network, and we have just not been able to detect them. And then we aggressively search all our systems for any sign of the intrusion. So without any proof, we assume we have been compromised. Let's go find them. And then finally, for this lecture, we have UEBA, User and Entity Behavior Analytics. With UEBA, we use deep learning or machine learning to model typical and atypical user behavior, setting a baseline. Just like any other system that looks at behavior, it is important that the baseline is made when we are not under attack. Otherwise, the system under attack looks like normal. Now, assuming we get the baseline, we're not under attack, well then when we are, then we can spot the anomalies and the threats much sooner because we know this is what it should look like. Now, all of a sudden, it looks like this. To do that, we really need three things. We need use cases. What does normal user behavior look like on our network? And remember, different users have different network usage. Then we need proper data sources. For that, we would either use a data lake, a data warehouse, or a SIEM system. We would not deploy the sensors directly. And then, of course, the machine learning needs some analytics so we can build a baseline so we can detect the anomalies. And you can see the concurrent thread here, right? In much of what we've talked about in this lecture and previous lectures, we use automation to look for anything that's out of the ordinary. And early on in implementations of systems like this, we may get a lot of false positives, but over time, as we tweak the system, it should be more and more useful. And with that, we are done with this lecture. I will see you in the next one.